If I had known what was about to happen, I would never have started that night so carefree. The night shift at the funeral home had always been peaceful for me, a heavy silence that, over time, I came to consider a friend. The white, cold lights cast their pale glow over the marble floor, creating shadows in the corners. Solitude no longer bothered me. Unlike many, I found comfort in the somber calm of that place. But something that night was about to change. I was in the preparation room, finishing the embalming of a body for the morning's wake. Everything was going as usual until I realized there was one more body left to attend to. Nothing out of the ordinary. An elderly man, deceased from natural causes. I double-checked the documents. Everything was in order. The routine was almost automatic for me, every move meticulous and respectful. I was prepared for a few more hours of work, without suspecting what awaited me. I walked to the preparation table where the body should have been. The silence around me was oppressive, but I was used to that. However, as I approached the table, something made me stop. The body wasn't there. The sheet, neatly folded beside it, was untouched, but the table was completely empty. I stood still for a few seconds, processing what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I knew I had left the body there. It had simply disappeared. My first reaction was disbelief. How could a body just vanish? I looked around, searching for an explanation. Perhaps a colleague had moved the corpse without telling me, but that didn't make sense. I was alone that night, and all the doors were locked. The discomfort began to turn into something more. A strange feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to stay calm, forcing myself not to think the worst. Despite the growing nervousness, I needed to act. Maybe I was making a silly mistake, and the body had been moved elsewhere. But the silence around me began to bother me in a way it never had before. I decided to investigate. I walked into the hallway, trying to convince myself I would find the body somewhere else, but the cold sensation running down my spine told me otherwise. Something had changed that night. I headed to the registry room, trying to stay calm, but the discomfort inside me was growing. I wanted to believe someone had moved the body without telling me, though I knew it was unlikely. I reviewed the documents again, checking for any note about the body being moved. Nothing. Everything indicated that the body should have been in the preparation room, where I had left it earlier. But it wasn't there, and that made no sense. The situation became even stranger when I checked the access logs. No other employee had been in the building in the last few hours. I was the only one on duty that night. The more I tried to find a logical explanation, the more impossible everything seemed. Could I have moved the body without realizing? An absurd idea, but one I forced myself to consider for a moment. However, my memory was clear. I had left the body on the table, and it had simply disappeared. I decided to return to the preparation room, though the thought filled me with growing discomfort. The walk down the hallways had never seemed so long. The narrow walls, normally so familiar, now felt oppressive. Every step I took echoed disturbingly in the funeral home's silence. When I finally reached the room, the sight of the empty table hit me like a punch. The body really wasn't there. I refused to give in to panic, but the feeling that something inexplicable was happening had already taken hold of my thoughts. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. There was an explanation for all this. I just needed to find it. Maybe I was simply tired. The night shift often left me slow and confused. I decided to check the other rooms. I walked through the hallways and opened the doors to the cold compartments, hoping to find the body mistakenly placed there. But every room I opened was exactly as it should be. The discomfort in my stomach grew. The feeling of being completely alone in that vast, silent building began to affect me in a different way. The silence that had once comforted me now seemed full of threats. I felt a chill down my spine, something I had never felt before in all my years working there. What was happening was not normal. I decided to continue the search, but the fear that something bigger was at play clung to me like a shadow. I resolved to broaden my search, walking down the corridors and checking every room I normally wouldn't need to visit. I passed through the wake area, where coffins awaited the bodies to be prepared. The environment there was always cold, but that night it felt colder than usual. The silence was so deep that my footsteps seemed to echo much louder than they should. Something was wrong. and the thought of continuing to search for the body alone was beginning to truly scare me. Every room I inspected was in order. The bodies prepared for the next day's funerals were in their places, untouched. But the elderly man's body, the one that should have been under my care, remained missing. I looked again at the funeral home's doors, and as expected, they were all locked. I knew I was alone. No one else could have entered without me noticing, but that only made everything more disturbing. How could the body have just disappeared? I began to question my own sanity. Was I tired? Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But at the same time, something told me it wasn't just exhaustion. There was something strange in the air, something I couldn't explain. An invisible pressure, a weight that made the simple act of walking through the halls more difficult. I didn't know what to think, but the idea that the body might have been moved by something beyond my understanding began to invade my thoughts. That's when I heard the first sound. It was low, muffled, as if coming from far away. I stopped immediately, my heart racing in my chest. The sound seemed to come from the back of the building, from the cold chamber, where the bodies are kept before being prepared. There shouldn't have been any noise coming from there. Bodies don't move. But at that moment, everything I knew seemed uncertain. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just the building, the plumbing, or some other normal sound. Still, something inside me knew that sound wasn't normal. The unease turned into real fear. Every step I took toward the cold chamber felt like an effort. The path there, once just part of my daily routine, now felt like a journey full of tension. What would I find? I reached the cold chamber door with my heart pounding. The muffled sound continued, now a bit clearer. It was a kind of scratching, a light but constant movement. I gripped the handle tightly, hesitating for a moment before opening the door. The cold air enveloped me immediately, the chilled atmosphere creating a mist around me. Inside, everything seemed in order, at first glance at least. But something was different. One of the coffins was slightly out of place. The feeling that something was wrong intensified. I approached the coffin, trying to stay calm. My eyes focused on the slightly open lid. It wasn't supposed to be like that. The coffins in the cold chamber are always kept closed, perfectly aligned. With every step I took toward the coffin, I felt a greater pressure in my chest, as if the air were being sucked out of the room. That scratching sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even worse. With trembling hands, I touched the coffin lid. The cold metal seemed to burn my skin, but I couldn't hesitate now. Slowly, I lifted the lid. What I saw made me freeze. Inside was the body of the elderly man who had disappeared. But he wasn't lying peacefully, as I had left him. He was in a strange position, his body slightly twisted as if he had moved on his own. His eyes, which I knew had been closed, were now partially open. Horror gripped me. This wasn't possible. Bodies don't move, not on their own. But there he was, in a position that suggested something terrible had happened. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think straight. I slammed the coffin shut and backed away, panic taking over. The muffled sound returned, as if it were coming from all directions. I didn't know what to do. The fear I felt was paralyzing. With my heart racing, I left the cold chamber, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. That place, once just my workplace, now felt like a trap. Something was terribly wrong, and I didn't know what to do or where to go. I just knew I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. I couldn't shake the image of the body from my mind. Those half-open eyes, the body twisted unnaturally, as if it had moved on its own. But that was impossible. I knew it. Even so, what I had seen left no room for doubt. The body was no longer in the position I had left it. Panic began to consume me. I tried to stay logical, but reality seemed distorted. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. With trembling hands, I opened the cold chamber door again. That oppressive silence still dominated the room. I walked back to the displaced coffin, hoping against all reason that what I had seen was just an illusion. But when I lifted the lid again, there he was, the elderly man's body, in the same disturbing position. His eyes were now fully open. A chill ran through me. There was no way this was natural. Something had changed. I backed away quickly, desperately trying to find a logical explanation, but I couldn't think of anything that made sense. The body seemed to have moved of its own accord, and I was alone, completely alone. I looked around. The environment no longer felt the same. The shadows seemed deeper, as if the very space around me were changing. The fear I felt was overwhelming, but at the same time, I knew I had to get out of there. But where could I go? The funeral home was isolated, and the night shift trapped me in that place. As my mind spun, trying to figure out what to do, the lights began to flicker. First subtly, then with increasing intensity, until the room seemed to pulse with strange energy. The air became heavy, almost suffocating. I felt trapped, as if the very atmosphere was closing in on me. Fear turned into desperation. Something very wrong was happening, and I was right in the middle of it. Instinct told me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave. That place, that cold chamber, was becoming unbearable. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I rushed out of the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. But what terrified me even more was the sound I heard right behind me. A slow, heavy breathing, irregular, as if something were following me. The lights in the funeral home continued to flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt alive, pulsing. The sound of breathing behind me grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. My heart was racing so fast I could hardly breathe. Everything around me seemed to close in, as if the very space were shrinking, trying to crush me. I ran down the hallway, feeling the heavy air slowing my movements. As I ran, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound wasn't just heavy breathing. It was more than that. It was as if something was moving, something behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The image of the elderly man's body, with his open eyes, his bizarre posture in the coffin, was burned into my mind. Something had pulled him out of that inert state. Something had made him move, and now he was there, with me. I knew I couldn't face him. I didn't know how. My body trembled uncontrollably as I ran through the empty hallways. Every door I passed, every dark corner seemed to hide something, watching every move I made. The lights continued to flicker, and the sound of the breathing, heavy, irregular, seemed closer, surrounding me. The funeral home, once just a workplace, had now become a maze of terror, a real nightmare from which I couldn't escape. Finally, I reached the exit door. My trembling fingers grabbed the handle, but when I tried to turn it, nothing happened. The door was locked from the inside. A wave of absolute panic washed over me. I was trapped. I tried again, harder, but the handle wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and this time, they went out completely for a second, plunging everything into absolute darkness. The only sound I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the slow, heavy breathing right behind me. I slowly turned, my whole body paralyzed with terror. At that moment, I knew what I was about to see. And yet, when my eyes finally focused on what was in front of me, the fear hit me in a way I never imagined possible. The elderly man's body was there, standing, right in the middle of the hallway. He was staring at me with his empty, expressionless eyes. His lips were slightly parted, and from them came the heavy breathing I had heard. My body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The fear consumed me entirely. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The elderly man's body, which should have been lying motionless in the coffin, was now standing right in front of me. He blocked my only way out, his empty eyes fixed on mine, as if seeing me in a way no living being could. That oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of the irregular breathing I had heard earlier. Now, it came directly from him. I tried to process the scene, but my body was completely paralyzed by fear. My legs wouldn't respond. I knew I had to run. I had to do something, but the terror that enveloped me was like a heavy shroud, immobilizing me. The figure in front of me seemed to move slowly, its feet dragging on the floor as if walking was a supernatural effort. But there was something terribly wrong with that movement. It wasn't natural. None of this was. The air around me felt frozen, and with every passing second, I felt the fear grow, suffocating. He took another step toward me, and I felt my throat close up, the scream trapped in my chest, unable to escape. What I was seeing wasn't possible. Bodies don't stand up on their own. They don't walk, they don't breathe. But there he was, just a few meters away, slowly getting closer, as if determined to reach me. I knew that if he got any closer, I would be lost. There was something deeply malevolent in those dead eyes, something beyond comprehension. Finally, my body responded. With tremendous effort, I managed to take a step back, then another, until I felt the cold wall behind me. I was cornered. He was just a few steps away, and I knew I had nowhere left to run. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to convince myself that this was a nightmare, that somehow I would wake up soon. But when I opened my eyes again, he was even closer. The sound of his heavy breathing filled the hallway. I felt the ground tremble slightly beneath my feet. Then the figure stopped. His eyes, once empty and lifeless, locked onto mine with an intensity that made me shudder. He raised his hand as if about to touch me, and my whole body froze. I knew that if he reached me, it would be the end. A visceral fear took over. The world around me began to spin, and my vision blurred. All I could do was pray for it to end soon. Darkness took over. I don't know how much time passed, but when I regained consciousness, everything was silent again. The environment around me was still, as if time had stopped. The lights had stopped flickering, and the air was no longer heavy. I was still on the floor, leaning against the wall, my body trembling and soaked in cold sweat. When I finally mustered the strength to look around, the elderly man's body had disappeared. The hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I slowly got up, my muscles sore and stiff from the panic they had endured. The feeling of unreality still hung over me. I knew that what had happened was not normal. It wasn't something that could be explained logically. I wanted to run out of that place, but my legs could barely support me. I looked down the hallway one last time, expecting to see some sign of the body, but it had vanished, as if it had never been there. With unsteady steps, I returned to the preparation room. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but I tried to focus. When I opened the door, I found my coworkers. They had just arrived for the morning shift. I couldn't speak. My words seemed to fade before they even formed. They noticed my condition, helped me sit down, but I knew they would never be able to understand what had happened that night. When they asked what had happened, all I could murmur repeatedly was, "Something woke up, something woke up." My voice was weak, lost. They looked at me with concern, but the gravity of what I was trying to say didn't seem to reach them. I felt trapped in a cycle of horror they would never comprehend. I knew that, even if I explained everything, no one would believe me. Who would believe me? The morning passed slowly, and at some point, I was taken home, still in shock. Later, I learned that the elderly man's body had been returned to the coffin, exactly as it should have been, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen and felt. And worst of all, I knew that it wasn't over. Something had awakened that night, and somehow, I was connected to it. The silence, once my refuge, was now the reminder of the terror I could never forget. I had always taken pride in my work. As a florist, my duty was to ensure that the floral arrangements I prepared were perfect, especially for funerals, where flowers represented more than just decorations. They were gestures of respect and farewell. For years, I worked with the same funeral home, providing impeccable arrangements that would typically last several days. However, in recent weeks, something strange began to happen. The flowers I delivered were wilting far too quickly. At first, I thought it might be a problem with the supplier. Perhaps the flowers were arriving with some kind of pest, or maybe the transportation was affecting their quality. But no, I checked everything. The flowers were fresh when they left my shop, and even more resilient flowers like lilies and chrysanthemums were drying out in a matter of hours, something that made no sense. It deeply bothered me, and I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Over time, I began to notice a disturbing pattern. This phenomenon only happened with the flowers I delivered to that specific funeral home. At other funerals, at other ceremonies, the flowers maintained their freshness for days, as expected. But whenever I delivered flowers there, it was as if they lost their vitality the moment they entered the building. Something was acting upon them, and I didn't know what. I began to obsess over the idea that there was something about that place that I didn't understand. With each new delivery, my discomfort grew. It was as if something at the funeral home was draining the life from the flowers. Something invisible, yet powerful. I could sense that it wasn't normal. I was already beginning to lose clients because of it, but the most terrifying part was the feeling that something beyond the natural was happening there. I needed to understand what was causing it. I couldn't keep ignoring it. That's when I decided to investigate on my own. If there was something wrong with the funeral home, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The idea of spending time in that place made me uneasy, but my curiosity and the need to uncover the truth were stronger. I planned to attend one of the upcoming funerals without revealing my intentions. I wanted to observe closely what was happening with the flowers I prepared. I arrived at the funeral home on the day of the wake with a fresh arrangement of flowers in hand, trying to remain calm. It was a cold morning, and the air felt heavier than usual. As soon as I entered the building, a wave of discomfort hit me. There was something strange in the air, something that wasn't just psychological. The environment was oppressive, colder than it should have been, and a sense of heaviness seemed to hang over everything. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to shake off the unease. I wasn't there just as a florist, I was investigating. The silence inside the funeral home was different. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought calm or respect, but a dense, suffocating silence. Every step I took seemed to make the air around me heavier. I handed the flowers to the funeral home staff and sat at the back of the room, watching closely. The arrangements I had prepared were placed around the coffin, and I knew them well. I knew exactly how they should behave. But something was wrong. As soon as the arrangements were set, I noticed the flowers began to wilt almost immediately. There was no way that was normal. The petals' freshness faded, and the stems started to droop in a fast and unnatural way. I watched every detail, incredulous. It was as if something was draining the life from the flowers, sucking away their vitality right before my eyes. My heart began to race, and the anxiety I had tried to suppress surfaced. I looked around the room, trying to find some explanation. The people present at the wake were quiet, all focused on the deceased. No one seemed to notice what was happening to the flowers. But I saw it clearly. Something in that funeral home was causing the flowers to die rapidly. The air around me felt denser, colder, and the feeling that something was wrong only grew. It wasn't just a coincidence. My instinct screamed that there was something deeper happening there. It wasn't just a problem with the temperature or the quality of the flowers. The entire environment seemed wrong. Something in that place seemed to be consuming the life around it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the phenomenon wasn't limited to just the flowers. What else was being affected in there? I needed to find out, but fear was starting to take hold of me. I sat at the back of the room, my eyes fixed on the arrangements I had prepared. It was disturbing to watch the flowers, which had been fresh and full of life just hours earlier, wilt so quickly before me. The ceremony continued in silence, with the family gathered around the coffin, but I could barely focus on the sadness of the occasion. My mind was completely consumed by whatever seemed to be stealing the vitality of the flowers. What could be causing this? At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. Perhaps the air in the room was really too dry, or the temperature was wrong for keeping the flowers fresh for so long. However, every time I looked at the arrangements, I felt that something invisible was draining them. The petals wrinkled, the vibrant colors faded, and the leaves dried up as if they had been left under the hot sun for days. But, in reality, only minutes had passed. The air in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating. I looked around, hoping someone else would notice what I was seeing, but no one seemed to. For them, it was just another funeral. The people were lost in their grief and their memories of the deceased. Only I seemed aware that something was deeply wrong. A shiver ran down my spine, and I began to wonder if the flowers were the only thing being affected in that room. As the ceremony went on, I began to notice other unsettling details. The room seemed to have grown colder, heavier, as if the very air had become difficult to breathe. A slight tremor took hold of my body, but it wasn't the physical cold. It was something different, something I couldn't explain. My heart was racing, and anxiety was beginning to overwhelm me. I knew I was witnessing something that had no rational explanation, but what could it be? I tried to concentrate on the ceremony, to shift my attention away from the flowers, but the feeling that something invisible and disturbing was hovering over the room wouldn't leave me. With each passing minute, the atmosphere seemed denser, as if an invisible shadow were hanging over us, draining everything that was alive. I needed to get out of there, but at the same time, curiosity kept me rooted in place. Something was happening, and I needed to know what it was. The air in the room seemed to press down on me, growing thicker and harder to breathe. My hands were sweaty, and my mouth was dry. Something inside me was screaming that I needed to leave as quickly as possible, but I was paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening. I looked around again, searching for any sign that someone else might be feeling the same way. But everyone else seemed oblivious to what I was experiencing. How could no one else notice? Each second in that room dragged on, agonizingly slow. The air was cold, but not in an ordinary way. It was a cold that seemed to come from within, that penetrated the skin and lodged in the bones. The discomfort was turning into growing fear, a sense that something malevolent was happening, invisible to the eyes but palpable in the air. My legs wanted to carry me out, but my body wouldn't respond, trapped by the morbid curiosity of what might happen next. I looked at the flowers, and seeing them wilt so rapidly only made the situation more bizarre. It was as if the flowers were being drained in some way. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the temperature or the physical environment. There was something else in that place, something that didn't belong to the world of the living. I could feel that now more clearly than ever. The air around me seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand. I tried to take a deep breath to calm myself, but the air felt too thick, too heavy. My chest was tight, and with each breath, it seemed like less oxygen was reaching my lungs. I looked at the others, all lost in their thoughts of grief. No one seemed to notice the strange atmosphere taking over the room. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining all of this? Was it just the emotional weight of being at a funeral? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Something much deeper was happening there. Something I couldn't see but could feel in every cell of my body. Fear was consuming me, and the only thing keeping me there was the need to understand. The air grew heavier, and then an even more sinister feeling washed over me. I wasn't alone. Something or someone was there, watching, and somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The air was so heavy that breathing became a challenge. I shifted in my seat, trying to alleviate the growing discomfort within me. I looked once more at the floral arrangements near the coffin. The flowers were practically dead. Petals had fallen to the ground. Leaves were dry, and the stems had drooped. My eyes fixed on one of the flowers as it softly dropped to the floor. It seemed like an ordinary scene, but my whole body tensed up with an inexplicable dread. It was then, as I bent down to pick up the fallen flower, that something paralyzed me. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The coffin had moved, or at least it seemed like something inside it had shifted. Shock coursed through my body. I knelt on the floor, unsure if what I had seen was real or just the product of my disturbed mind. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like an endless moment, trying to convince myself that it had been my imagination. Maybe it was the weight of the environment, the grief in the air, or the simple fact of being surrounded by death and sadness. But what happened in that moment felt far too real. I stood up slowly, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, searching for any reaction from the people at the wake. Everyone remained quiet, absorbed in their own thoughts. No one seemed to have noticed what I saw. No one seemed to have felt the coffin move. I began to question my sanity, but the scene unfolding before me kept screaming that something was wrong. The air was colder now, more oppressive, and the silence that filled the room was suffocating. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, stressed from work and the mystery of the wilting flowers, but the unease within me wouldn't subside. I knew I had seen the coffin move, and, more disturbingly, there was the feeling that something inside it was alive. The flowers around the coffin continued to wilt, as if something was draining them, sucking the energy from the room. Whatever was inside that coffin seemed to be feeding, and I couldn't ignore that. With trembling hands, I approached the coffin, as if pulled by an invisible force. Something inside me screamed to leave, to walk away, but my curiosity and fear were intertwined in a way that I couldn't make a rational decision. I needed to know what was happening. The air around me seemed to vibrate, and the silence was broken by a faint scratching sound coming from inside the coffin. My feet moved almost on their own, and soon I was standing in front of the coffin. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were clammy with cold sweat. I knew I shouldn't. I knew what I was about to do was madness, but something stronger than fear pushed me forward. Slowly, I lifted the lid of the coffin, just enough to look inside. What I saw made me instantly recoil. The corpse, which should have been motionless, was surrounded by something grotesque. Dry leaves, dead petals, and twisted branches seemed to have grown around the body, as if the flowers were being sucked dry by it. It was as if death itself were absorbing the life from the plants, creating a mantle of decay around the corpse. The smell of decomposition mixed with the dry scent of dead flowers, forming a suffocating combination that made me nauseous. My knees buckled, and I had to lean on the coffin to keep from falling. I tried to collect myself, but the shock still paralyzed me. The body was surrounded by something that seemed alive, and the feeling that the corpse itself had something to do with what was happening was undeniable. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. That cold shiver ran down my spine, and a shadow of dread enveloped me. The dead flowers around the body weren't normal, and whatever was happening in there went far beyond any logical explanation. I looked around, hoping someone else was witnessing what I was seeing. Yet, no one seemed to notice the heavy, somber atmosphere that was crushing me. Everyone present at the wake remained focused on their mourning, seemingly oblivious to the disturbing reality unfolding a few steps away. I felt isolated, as if the room were closing in on me, and the invisible presence that hovered in that place was beginning to suffocate my own perception of what was real. I tried to step back, but at that moment, I felt an even more terrifying presence. The weight in the air around me became unbearable. I knew I wasn't alone. Something in there was aware of me, something that shouldn't have been alive. And before I could react, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, a light but firm touch that sent chills down my spine. I turned, screaming in pure terror, but when I looked behind me, there was no one. The scream escaped my throat before I could stop it. I turned abruptly, still feeling the cold hand on my shoulder, but there was no one there. Panic took over me. I looked in all directions, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening, but the room remained silent, motionless. The people around me stared at me with surprise and reproach. They didn't understand what was happening. Only I could feel the oppressive presence moving through the room, like an invisible shadow. My breathing was erratic, my body trembling. I tried to pull myself together, to ignore the fear consuming me, but something inside me told me the threat hadn't disappeared. I knew the hand I felt was real, and that whatever it was trying to communicate, warn me, or worse, intimidate me. My mind was a mess, but the only clear thought was that I needed to leave, and quickly. I looked around, searching for an exit, but each step felt harder to take. As people resumed the ceremony, ignoring my behavior, I felt that strange sensation again, as if the air around me were moving, as if something were walking with me. The weight of the atmosphere grew even more intense, and the cold around me felt like it was slicing through my skin. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something much deeper, as if an invisible force were draining the energy from the place, from the flowers, and from me. I felt my legs weaken. I was growing weaker, as if the presence was slowly sucking the life out of me. Fear turned to absolute terror when I realized that whatever had been draining the flowers and the environment was now focused on me. I felt the pressure increase, and my body seemed to be crushed by an invisible force. Once again, I looked around, hoping to see something or someone, but what hit me was a terrible realization. I was the only one who could perceive what was happening. I was alone, trapped in this nightmare. The people around me were oblivious to the horror unfolding just a few feet away. With my heart pounding in my chest, I took one final step back, but my body froze as I felt that cold touch again. This time, it was as if something were grabbing me with more force. A cold shiver ran through my body. I spun around abruptly, again finding no one. However, absolute fear overwhelmed me, and I could no longer stay there. Something terrible was happening in that funeral home, something beyond human comprehension, and I knew that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't come out whole. Panic completely took over me. Without a second thought, I turned and ran toward the funeral home's exit. I had to get out, leave behind that heavy, oppressive environment and the feeling of being watched. Every step I took felt like an immense effort, as if the very ground were trying to pull me back. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't. The fear of what I might see prevented me from doing so. The only thing that mattered now was escaping that cursed place. The front door seemed miles away, but I finally reached the handle and turned it with force. The cold night air wrapped around me as I stepped outside. It was an immediate relief, but the fear was still there, clinging to my mind. I ran to my car, trembling and out of breath, as if I were escaping from something that could still catch me. I got inside the car quickly, locking the doors, as if that could protect me from something I couldn't even see. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to control my breathing, but each attempt seemed in vain. I looked at the funeral home through the windshield, expecting to see something moving, some shadow in the window, but everything appeared calm. The silence inside contrasted with the storm of fear and despair that I felt. However, I knew what had happened wasn't my imagination. I knew it was real. Something in that funeral home was alive, sucking the energy from the flowers, draining the atmosphere, and now, somehow, it had touched me too. I started the car and drove away as fast as I could, without looking back. The drive home was a blur of chaotic thoughts and images I would never forget. When I arrived, locked in my own safe space, the terror was still there. The memory of the corpse surrounded by dead flowers, the invisible hand touching me, all of it echoed in my mind, like a nightmare that doesn't end when you wake up. In the days that followed, I tried to avoid thinking about what had happened, but the fear continued to haunt me. I never went back to that funeral home. Something inside me knew I couldn't face it again. Strangely, the flowers I sold to other clients returned to normal. They lasted as they should, never wilting so quickly again. But the mystery of what happened in that funeral home never left my mind. And even now, whenever I deliver flowers, I wonder if, at some point, that presence will come looking for me again. If I had known what was about to happen that night, perhaps I would have left everything unfinished and gotten out of there as quickly as possible. But, as usual, the deep silence of the funeral home seemed harmless. I had gotten used to spending hours alone, working night shifts. However, there was something different about that night. Maybe it was the fact that the body I was preparing had come from a death shrouded in mystery. The deceased had been found under strange circumstances, and the family had requested a private wake. I knew that in my line of work, dealing with tragedy was common, but the atmosphere that night felt heavier than usual. The story of the mysterious death had spread among the staff, and rumors circulated about what might have happened. Still, my focus was simple: ensure that the body was ready for the wake the next day. The clock showed it was just after 11 at night, and I had already finished most of the preparations. Yet, the environment around me felt more oppressive than usual. The funeral home was a quiet place, but that night the silence seemed alive, almost tangible. Every movement I made, the sliding of the casket, the adjustment of the flowers, echoed through the empty halls as if the building itself was amplifying the sounds. I tried to concentrate, keeping my mind focused on the task, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me in peace. I glanced at the man's body one last time before stepping away. He appeared to be at peace, but something about him deeply unsettled me. The weight of the night seemed to grow heavier as the hours passed. When the clock neared midnight, I decided to take a break. I sat down for a moment, trying to dispel the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. I had always known that working in a funeral home could be unnerving, but that night the discomfort was real, almost palpable. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the effect of exhaustion and solitude. The work was nearly done, and soon I would be able to go home. That's when I heard the knock at the door. The sharp, firm sound cut through the night's silence like a blade. My body froze for a moment. Who would be knocking at the funeral home door at this hour? I stood up, hesitant, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked to the door, feeling the tension increase with each step. When I opened it, I found a man I didn't expect to see there. The man at the door looked tired, his face shadowed and etched with lines of tension. He wore a heavy coat, and his eyes were fixed on me with an uncomfortable intensity. "I'm the brother of the deceased," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to see him. Now." The urgency in his words was clear, but there was something more in his tone. A coldness that made my stomach churn. I knew it wasn't allowed for visitors to come in at this hour, especially before the wake. "I'm sorry, sir, but visitors aren't allowed at this time. The family will be able to see the body during the wake tomorrow," I explained, keeping my voice calm and controlled. The man frowned and stepped forward. There was something about his presence that made me uncomfortable. "I understand the rules, but I need to see him. I'm his brother." "This can't wait," he insisted. His expression was serious, but strangely devoid of any grief or sadness. That disturbed me. The way he spoke didn't seem like that of someone who wanted to say goodbye to a loved one. There was something wrong with him, and it put me on alert. "I'm sorry, but I really can't make exceptions," I reinforced, trying to end the conversation there. The man seemed unfazed, as if my words didn't matter. "I'm not asking out of whim," he said, his voice growing colder. "I need to see my brother. Now." His persistence deeply unsettled me. He seemed less concerned about bidding farewell to the deceased and more interested in something I couldn't identify. My discomfort grew with every passing second in his presence. The atmosphere around us felt even more dense, almost suffocating. I needed to end this conversation. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'll have to ask you to return tomorrow," I insisted. The man stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing my words, before giving a small smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Very well," he said, finally stepping back. "But no, this isn't over." His words hung in the air like a veiled threat. As he disappeared into the darkness of the night, I stood still for a moment, my heart racing and fear settling in my chest. Something was very wrong with that visit. When I closed the door, the feeling that something worse was yet to come didn't leave me. I shut the door firmly, feeling the pressure of the environment around me. My hands were trembling, and the air inside the funeral home seemed even heavier. I returned to the room where I had been working, trying to focus, but something about the encounter with that man left me deeply unsettled. I couldn't stop thinking about his behavior. The coldness in his voice, the way he insisted on seeing the body. Nothing felt right. That wasn't the behavior of a grieving brother. I continued to organize the last details for the wake, but the discomfort refused to leave me. The man's words echoed in my mind. "This isn't over." Why had he said that? I tried to shake off the feeling of danger, convincing myself it was just a persistent visitor, someone who didn't accept the rules of the funeral home. However, something in the way he spoke, in the way his eyes seemed cold and calculating, left me with the sense that he was hiding something. Perhaps he wanted more than just to see his brother. Minutes dragged on, and the quietness of the funeral home, once comforting, now felt oppressive. The silence was absolute, but there was a tension in the air, as if something was waiting to happen. My thoughts returned to that man. What if he planned to return? His persistence made me feel that he wouldn't give up so easily. I looked at the clock. It was already past midnight, and the night shift still had hours to go. Every second seemed longer than the last. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze. Knocking again, but this time softer, as if someone was tapping the wood of the door more gently, almost deliberately. My body went rigid, and my heart raced. I didn't want to open the door again. Not that night. The memory of the visitor was still fresh in my mind. Whoever it was, it couldn't be a coincidence. Something inside me screamed not to answer. But the knocking continued, persistent. With a trembling hand, I approached the door once more. The sense that something very wrong was happening was too strong to ignore. I waited for a moment, trying to gather my courage, then cautiously opened the door. No one was there. The hallway was empty, enveloped in an oddly thick darkness. I looked outside, expecting to see some movement, but there was nothing, just the cold wind blowing. I quickly shut the door, feeling fear wash over me. What was happening? From that moment on, the air around me seemed to change completely. The funeral home, already a quiet place by nature, now felt as if it were breathing with its own energy, as if it were alive, waiting for something. I felt my body shrink involuntarily, as if an invisible presence surrounded me. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, longer, and every noise, even the slightest one, made my heart race. What had once been a solitary shift was transforming into something much darker. The encounter with the man who introduced himself as the deceased's brother wouldn't leave my mind. His cold insistence on seeing the body, the questions he asked, and especially the lack of genuine mourning in his voice. It was as if he were interested in something else, something beyond the death of a loved one. But what could he want with the body? And worse, why were the circumstances of the man's death so mysterious? The feeling that I was missing some important piece of the puzzle deeply disturbed me. I began to mentally review our brief conversation. The man seemed less concerned about the deceased and more focused on the circumstances of his death. His questions about how the body was found and why the death was considered mysterious kept echoing in my mind. It was unusual for a relative to ask for such detail, especially in the tone he used. Now, away from his presence, I began to realize that perhaps I was dealing with something much more disturbing than it appeared at first glance. Time seemed to drag on, and every sound in the funeral home kept me on edge. I tried to return to work, arranging the last preparations, but the discomfort was inescapable. Each second, my mind returned to the man and his invasive questions. The silence, once so familiar, now seemed a prelude to something terrible. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the effect of being alone at night in a naturally eerie place. But at the same time, I knew something else was at play. Then, another unexpected sound echoed through the room. This time, a faint noise coming from some distant part of the funeral home. It wasn't knocking at the door anymore, but something different. It seemed to come from inside. My senses went into high alert. I looked around, expecting to find some sign of what was happening, but everything around me remained exactly as before. The funeral home was steeped in a calm that now felt unsettling. A calm before the storm. I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening, but fear grew within me. I tried to concentrate on the work, arranging the final details for the next day's wake, but my mind was fixated on that man. Everything about him seemed wrong, from the way he spoke to the questions he asked. When I inquired if there was anything else he wanted to know about his brother, he went beyond the usual information. His questions were invasive. How was he found? The man had asked earlier, in a tone that made me shiver. I explained that the information I had was limited, but what I knew was that the death had been considered mysterious, although there were no clear signs of foul play. But he persisted, asking about details even I didn't know. Was he alone when he died? Was there anything strange about the body? Any unusual marks? With each question, the tension between us grew, and I knew he was after something I couldn't fully comprehend. What disturbed me most was how the man seemed less interested in mourning and more obsessed with discovering something about the death itself. He didn't speak with emotion. There was a coldness to his words, a detachment I had never seen in someone grieving a family member. It felt more like an interview than a conversation with someone trying to cope with loss. What did he have at the moment of death? Was one of his last questions, and that phrase had been haunting me ever since he left. As I adjusted the casket, I felt my breath quicken. There was nothing I could say to justify that question, and it kept lingering in my mind. The man wasn't worried about his brother. He was worried about what his brother had. But what? An object? A secret? I couldn't comprehend it, but something told me that man hadn't really left. He planned to return. I began locking all the doors of the funeral home, one by one, preparing for the possibility that he might try to return that night. Each door I locked increased my sense of security, but at the same time, the feeling of imminent danger grew. I couldn't shake the idea that he was hiding something. Whatever it wasn't just the body of his brother he was after. He wanted something more, something I still couldn't understand. The sense that the man could return at any moment kept me on high alert. My senses were heightened, and every little sound made my heart race. I needed to figure out what he was really after, but at the same time, I feared that if he came back, his intentions would be much darker than I could imagine. It was during another attempt to resume my work that things began to take an even more disturbing turn. The man's questions still echoed in my mind, but I tried to push them away, focusing on the task at hand. However, something about that night wouldn't allow things to proceed as they should. The air felt heavier, and every second seemed to stretch out, heightening my anxiety. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the room where the body was. My heart leaped in my chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop in the middle of the corridor. It was as if something had moved in the absolute silence of the funeral home. Hesitantly, I walked toward the preparation room, trying to convince myself that the noise could have been anything. A creak of wood, the old building responding to the cold night air. However, as I approached, the sound returned, clearer this time. I slowly entered the room, trying to stay calm, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The casket, which I had closed and left prepared, was slightly open. My mind began to race, trying to find a logical explanation. I had closed the casket before leaving. Of that, I was certain. I took a deep breath and approached, the feeling of dread growing in my chest. What was happening here? Could it have been the wind? Some mistake on my part? But the air inside the funeral home was completely still. With trembling hands, I closed the casket again, forcing myself to believe I must have made a mistake. But as I did so, a chill ran down my spine. There was something wrong with that body. I looked at the pale face of the deceased and noticed, with horror, that some of the flowers around the body were starting to wilt, as if something were draining the life out of them. My hands quickly recoiled from the casket, and fear overtook me. The memory of the man's questions returned to the forefront of my mind. He wasn't the brother of the deceased. He was after something that, somehow, was connected to the body. And I knew that whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. Whatever had brought that man to the funeral home that night was beyond my understanding. But one thing was certain: he would come back. And when he returned, I wouldn't be safe. The weight of what was happening pressed down on me. I knew I had to prepare because what was coming wouldn't be good. Something dark and inexplicable was hidden in that night. Something I could barely understand but felt deeply. The man's warning echoed in my head. I'll be back later. And now, more than ever, I knew that was a promise. I knew I could no longer ignore the signs. Something strange was happening, and it all revolved around the man who appeared at the funeral home that night. He wasn't the deceased's brother. That much was clear now. But what did he want? And why had he been so insistent on seeing the body? The flowers wilting around the corpse gave me a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. There was something more sinister behind that man's death, something the visitor knew, and I was just beginning to realize. As I walked through the corridors, every shadow seemed more threatening. Every sound became an echo of something larger, something hidden. The funeral home, once a place of respectful silence, now seemed to breathe with an invisible and oppressive presence. My thoughts constantly returned to the man's words, "I'll be back later." What did he mean by that? He knew something I didn't, and the idea that he could show up at any moment kept me constantly on edge. I locked all the doors again, checking 2-3 times to ensure everything was secure. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, and the weight of fear accumulated inside me. The darkness outside seemed denser, and the silence deeper. I waited, unable to rest, every small sound making me jump. The funeral home was a place of rest for the dead, but that night, it felt like something was far from resting. Finally, while I tried to calm myself in the preparation room, I heard those knocks at the door again. The sound, though soft, seemed to pierce the thick, dark air around me. My heart raced. He was back. I knew it was him. My body froze for a moment, unable to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but the other part was trapped by curiosity and fear. Hesitantly, I walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier, as if something were trying to hold me back. I reached the door and waited. The knocking continued, rhythmic but slow, as if he were waiting for me to respond. My trembling hand reached for the doorknob, but I stopped. I knew that if I opened the door, nothing good would come of it. Those knocks were a promise that the horror had only just begun. Even so, I couldn't move away. I was caught between fear and curiosity, knowing that either way, I wasn't safe. I didn't open the door. I stood there, my hand still close to the knob, unable to move. The knocking stopped suddenly, but the silence that filled the funeral home was even more disturbing. The air around me felt frozen, as if time had stopped. Finally, I backed away, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I didn't have the courage to face that man that night. Something told me that if I opened the door, it wouldn't just be a conversation that took place there. I locked the door even tighter, making sure nothing could get in. But still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if the man was still on the other side, waiting patiently, knowing that eventually, fear would win. I couldn't leave, and I couldn't stay there either. I was trapped between the fear of running and the terror of staying, each moment leaving me more tense, more vulnerable. The hours dragged on, and every second felt like an eternity. Inside the funeral home, the silence was now suffocating. The wind outside rustled the trees, and shadows danced in the windows, forming shapes that seemed to watch me. I turned off the lights in the rooms one by one until only the hallway and the main room remained illuminated. Every noise, every slight movement made me imagine that he had gotten in somehow. Fear was etched into me, and I knew that night wouldn't end without an answer. Then, in a moment of desperation, I heard the sound of glass breaking from the back of the building. My heart raced. That man was trying to get in. I quickly grabbed a phone and called the police, explaining the situation in as few words as possible, trying not to sound insane. Minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. The sound was a temporary relief, but the terror that enveloped me didn't disappear. Had the mysterious visitor broken a window? Was he inside? The police arrived, and they checked the place. They didn't find anyone, only a slightly open window, as if it had been left poorly closed. They assured me that the place was safe, but I knew the danger hadn't disappeared. Even after the officers arrived, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The man had promised to return, and although he hadn't managed to enter that night, I knew he wouldn't give up. The warning was clear. He would come back, and when he returned, I would need to be prepared. The rest of the night was an endless vigil. Silence returned to the funeral home, but fear still pulsed inside me. From that moment on, I knew nothing would be the same. Whatever the man was looking for, he hadn't gotten it yet, and his search was far from over. All I could do was hope that, next time, I would be strong enough to face him. From the very first day Logan Price started working at the funeral home, something about his presence struck me as strange. He was reserved, spoke little, and kept a calculated distance from the other employees. As the owner, I was used to dealing with all kinds of people, but Logan was different. He completed his tasks with almost mechanical precision, but there was something unsettling in his behavior. Maybe it was how he never seemed to show emotion, or the way his eyes never reflected any expression. Despite this, I couldn't deny his efficiency. Even as an apprentice, his skills were impressive. He knew exactly what to do with minimal instruction, which was a relief at times, but also unnerving. His hands moved deftly over the bodies, as if he had done this hundreds of times before, despite his lack of formal experience. It didn't take long for the other staff to notice Logan's cold demeanor. The team whispered about his lack of social interaction, how he seemed constantly shrouded in an eerie silence. He didn't join in on casual conversations, never smiled, and always maintained that distant, fixed gaze. If he felt anything, he didn't show it. Some days, it seemed like Logan was completely disconnected from the world around him. It was as if he existed on a different plane, a presence that was subtle yet impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to be understanding, attributing his behavior to shyness or adjusting to the new job. But over time, things began to feel increasingly off. Something about him didn't add up, something that was hard to define. With each passing day, the atmosphere at the funeral home grew heavier, as though Logan's presence was draining the normalcy out of the place. Yet, there was no concrete reason for my unease. just an ever-growing sense that something wasn't right. What disturbed me the most was that no one knew much about him. Logan was a complete mystery. He never talked about his personal life, where he came from, or why he chose to work at a funeral home. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. The silence surrounding him was as thick as the smell of formaldehyde that clung to the air, and I couldn't shake the question. Who exactly was Logan Price? Weeks went by, and soon I began to notice a peculiar pattern in Logan's behavior. He seemed to have a preference for working late into the night. Even when the day's work was done, he volunteered to stay, claiming he liked finishing tasks in silence. On its own, this wasn't necessarily suspicious. Many people prefer the quiet of the night to get things done, especially in a funeral home, where death already brings a certain somber calm to the environment. But there was something more to his insistence on staying late. At first, I thought it was simply a matter of diligence. Maybe he wanted to impress, show that he was dedicated. But as time passed, I noticed Logan remained at the funeral home long after there was no need. Many nights, he stayed in the building well beyond normal hours, even when there were no more bodies to prepare or services to organize. It was as if he preferred to be there, alone, in the cold silence of the night, surrounded by the dead. The other employees began to whisper about this too. There were rumors in the hallways about how Logan seemed more comfortable around coffins and corpses than living people. Some said he would stand still for long periods, just staring at the bodies, as if waiting for something to happen. This, of course, could have been paranoia. A funeral home is the kind of place that plays tricks on the mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. One night, I decided to stay late to see if Logan's behavior was really as unusual as people said. And indeed it was. Shortly after everyone else had left, I watched him from a distance. He didn't seem to be tidying up or cleaning the place. Logan was wandering between the coffins with an expression I couldn't quite understand. There was something in the way he looked at the bodies, something that made my skin crawl. It was as if he was waiting for something to manifest. I watched for a few more minutes, and that's when I realized Logan wasn't simply working. He was studying the bodies. His eyes scanned the coffins in a way that sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about him, and the more I watched, the more I felt that his presence there, in the dead of night, had nothing to do with work. Logan was at home in the darkness, but I couldn't figure out why. That's when the doubts began to solidify in my mind. Why was Logan so insistent on working at night? And more importantly, what was he really doing during those hours when everyone else had gone home? As the days went by, the reports from my staff about Logan grew even more disturbing. It wasn't just that he preferred working at night. He seemed to be developing a strange obsession with the bodies. It became increasingly common to find him near the coffins long after all tasks had been completed. At first, I thought he was just being meticulous, maybe double-checking that everything was in order. But what I began to notice was far more unsettling. Logan would linger near the bodies for extended periods, even when there was nothing left to do. One night, I walked past the main hall of the funeral home and saw him standing beside a coffin, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the body inside. The deceased was an elderly man, whose funeral was scheduled for the next day. The way Logan gazed at the body made me stop in my tracks. He wasn't just checking if the coffin was properly placed, or if the flowers were arranged correctly. It was as if he was waiting for something. I stood there for several minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing. Logan didn't move, except to slightly tilt his head, as if he were listening to something. My mind scrambled to find a logical explanation for his behavior, but nothing made sense. It was almost as if he were hypnotized by the body in the coffin. When I finally decided to step in and ask what he was doing, he abruptly stepped away, as if caught in the middle of something he shouldn't have been doing. "Is everything all right, Logan?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He slowly turned to me, and for a moment, his eyes were blank, cold. "Yes," he replied calmly, not even blinking. "I was just praying for the dead." The explanation, though simple, didn't convince me. There was something about the way he said it, a coldness, an emotional distance that made me question if it was true. Even if it was, why did he spend so much time alone with the bodies? Something wasn't right, and I knew it. In the days that followed, I began paying even closer attention to Logan. Every time I saw him near a coffin, I was filled with a deep sense of unease. It was as if he were waiting for the dead to speak to him, as if there were a connection only he understood. The rest of the staff also grew more suspicious. Whispered comments circulated through the hallways, and I knew I wasn't the only one who sensed something was wrong. Logan wasn't just a quiet apprentice, he was hiding something. The situation reached a breaking point one night when I returned to the funeral home later than usual. I had forgotten an important document in my office, and I knew Logan was still on duty, finishing preparations for a service the next day. When I entered the building, the atmosphere was calm, as always, but the feeling of unease Logan carried with him seemed to have seeped into the place. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, and the dim lights cast long shadows down the corridors. I walked through the main hallway toward the room where the bodies were prepared. As I approached, I heard a voice. I stopped, feeling my heart race. It was Logan. He was speaking softly, almost whispering. I moved closer, trying to make out what he was saying, but his words were indistinct, muffled by the closed room. For a moment, I thought he might be on the phone, but when I reached the door, slightly ajar, I saw something that made me freeze. Logan was sitting beside a closed coffin, his head bowed forward, speaking softly as if engaged in an intimate conversation. My eyes widened. He wasn't talking on the phone, nor was he silently praying. He was speaking to the body inside the coffin. The sight chilled me to my core. His voice was low, almost comforting, but the content of his words was indecipherable. I stood there, frozen, watching this disturbing scene, unsure of how to react. When I finally regained control of my body, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Logan startled at the sound, turning quickly to face me. His expression was strangely neutral, as if there was nothing unusual about what I had just witnessed. "Logan, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. He looked at me for a moment, as if processing the question, then calmly stood up. "Just praying for the dead," he repeated, with that same unsettling calm. But there was something in his eyes, a calculated coldness that made my skin crawl. "Talking to them?" I pressed, trying to keep my composure. Logan glanced away for a brief moment, and then, without directly answering, began to walk away from the coffin. "Everyone needs someone to listen, even in death," he said, in a tone that seemed to carry a truth I couldn't understand. My skin prickled, and the sense that there was something deeply wrong with this young man only grew stronger. I stood there, watching as Logan left the room without looking back. The silence returned to the space, but that moment remained etched in my mind. Logan wasn't just a young apprentice with strange habits. There was something more going on, something that I still didn't understand, but I knew was far more disturbing than I could have imagined. His explanation about praying for the dead sounded more suspicious with each passing day. After seeing him sitting beside that coffin, whispering as if in conversation with the deceased, I knew there was something deeper happening. However, when I confronted him directly the next day, he remained calm and evasive. "I'm just honoring the dead," he repeated, never breaking that cold, controlled stare. It was as though he had rehearsed those responses, anticipating being questioned. That conversation only heightened my distrust. There was something sinister about the way he spoke, a coldness that didn't align with the nature of our work. He said the right words, but something was definitely wrong. Worst of all, despite all my probing questions, Logan remained impassive, refusing to offer any details or provide any clue as to why he behaved the way he did. It felt like I was hitting a wall of ice, unable to break through the barrier he had built around himself. "Praying for the dead is one thing," I said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "But what I saw last night, Logan, that's not normal. You were talking to the body like you expected a response." He barely smiled, an almost imperceptible grin that sent a shiver through me. "Everyone has their ways of connecting with the unknown," was the only answer he gave before walking away again, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. After that, things began to escalate. Logan became even more withdrawn, almost disappearing into the shadows of the funeral home, working at odd hours and avoiding interaction with the other employees. But what disturbed me most was that his presence seemed to be affecting the environment. The atmosphere at the funeral home grew heavier, as if something unseen was growing there. Something dark that fed on the silence, on death, and on Logan. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Logan was hiding something. Something he didn't want anyone to find out. The feeling that his presence at the funeral home wasn't a coincidence haunted me, and I had to understand what was happening before it was too late. That's when I decided to investigate his past. If he wasn't going to tell me the truth, then I would find out for myself. The first thing I did was reach out to his former employer. Most resumes come with references, and though Logan hadn't mentioned anything unusual about his previous jobs, something inside me knew this investigation would uncover more than he was willing to share. I called several funeral homes where he had worked before, and to my surprise, most of the responses I received were vague, or they simply hung up when they heard his name. After much persistence, one funeral director agreed to speak with me, but only for a few minutes, and on the condition that his name not be mentioned. "Logan Price?" he began, his voice low and cautious. "If I were you, I'd get rid of him as soon as possible." When I asked why, the response I received was vague but unsettling. "He makes people uncomfortable. I can't say more than that. No one likes to talk about what happened while he was here." That conversation only deepened my suspicions. What had Logan done in his previous jobs that made people so reluctant to speak openly about him? Later, with a bit more digging, I discovered he had been fired from several funeral homes. The reasons were never clear. Inappropriate behavior was mentioned, but without specific details. What disturbed me most was that in every place he had worked, there seemed to be a pattern of mystery and discomfort surrounding his presence. But the most unsettling information came when I tried to speak with the other apprentices who had worked alongside Logan. One of them, who agreed to talk anonymously, mentioned how Logan spent long hours alone with the bodies. He said he was praying, but that wasn't normal praying, the former colleague confessed, his voice trembling over the phone. He talked to them, as if he expected a response. And there were times when the bodies didn't seem the same after he spent so much time with them. Those words froze me. This wasn't just a coincidence. Logan had a pattern of bizarre and possibly disturbing behavior at every funeral home he had worked in. He interacted with the bodies in ways no one understood, and now, as I pieced everything together, the feeling that he was involved in something beyond human comprehension intensified. My mind began to imagine dark possibilities. Logan was involved in something deeper, something that connected him to the dead in ways I didn't want to understand. What if he was doing more than praying for the bodies? The connection he seemed to have with the deceased was more than morbid. It was as if he were trying to communicate with the other side. I knew, deep down, that the situation was reaching a breaking point. Logan wasn't just an odd apprentice. He was a dangerous enigma, and I needed to figure out what was really happening before it was too late. I knew I couldn't keep letting Logan continue without an explanation. His behavior, the way he interacted with the bodies, the sinister pattern repeating itself in every funeral home he had worked at, all of it pointed to something far darker than I was willing to admit. I decided it was time to confront him directly. I didn't know what I would find, but I needed the answers Logan refused to give. That night, I waited until all the other employees had gone. The funeral home was quiet, as usual, wrapped in that aura of peace that should have been comforting, but since Logan's arrival, had become suffocating. I knew he was still there, working somewhere in the dark corners of the building, and I decided I wouldn't leave without discovering the truth. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own as I walked down the halls toward the room where Logan often spent his lonely nights. When I found him, he was, once again, near a coffin, his eyes fixed on the body. His lips moved, murmuring words I couldn't hear. It was like watching a scene from a nightmare. The silence of the place, Logan's cold demeanor, and the motionless corpse beside him. My stomach churned, but I knew I couldn't hesitate. I had to act. "Logan!" My voice echoed through the room, louder than I intended. He turned slowly, without surprise, without emotion, just that icy gaze I was beginning to dread. "We need to talk. Now." He continued to stare at me in silence, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Why do you do this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why do you spend so much time with the bodies?" What are you looking for?" My questions came out sharper than I had planned, but I could no longer hide my fear. Logan stared at me for a few seconds before finally opening his mouth to speak. "I'm just trying to listen," he said, with that cold, controlled voice, void of any emotion. "What does that mean, Logan? Listen to what? To whom?" I pressed, feeling the dread inside me grow. He slowly approached, his footsteps echoing on the floor, and stopped a few feet from me. "The dead have much to say, Charles. You just need to know how to listen," he replied, with a faint smile that made me shiver. Those words seemed to come from a place so dark and deep that, for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "This is madness," I said, taking a step back. "You can't just stay here, night after night, talking to the dead. That's not normal. That's not right." My voice started to tremble, but Logan remained completely calm. He seemed in total control of the situation, as if he had known I would reach this point, and that I wouldn't be able to understand what he was truly doing. "You'll never understand, Charles," he said, his voice soft and almost hypnotic. "There's a connection that only a few can feel. And I am one of them." His eyes, locked onto mine, were cold as ice, and in that moment, I knew I was dealing with something far beyond what I had imagined. Logan wasn't just a strange apprentice. He was something far more dangerous. The next morning, after that confrontation, I returned to the funeral home with a deep sense of unease. The previous night still echoed in my mind, as if something greater had been set in motion. The silence was heavier than usual, and a chill ran down my spine as I entered the building. I knew something had changed, and when I went to the preparation room, my suspicions were confirmed. Logan was gone. His workspace was completely empty, as if he had never been there. The locker where he kept his belongings was open, and all his items were missing. No note, no trace of where he might have gone. It was as if Logan had evaporated overnight, leaving behind only the mystery of his presence. My staff began to comment on his disappearance, some relieved, others, like me, deeply unsettled. But the most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the files of the deceased Logan had worked closely with. Several recent records, names, addresses, causes of death, had vanished from the system. Logan had taken more than just his belongings. He had taken crucial information about the deceased, including details about their families. I was terrified at the implications of this. What was Logan planning? Where had he gone? And why did he need that information? I tried to track down any clues about where he might be, but it was as if he had disappeared from the face of the earth. No one knew where to find him, and his former employers continued to refuse to talk about him. The sense of danger lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Logan hadn't simply left. He was preparing for something bigger, something I feared to understand. In the days that followed, the mood at the funeral home grew tense. My staff, still unsettled by Logan's presence, tried to move on, but there was a shadow hanging over us. Every time I looked at the coffins, I remembered Logan standing there, as if waiting for the dead to speak to him. The mystery of what he was doing in those long hours of the night was never resolved, but one thing was certain. He knew something we didn't. I never found out where Logan went or what he intended to do with the information he took. But even now, when the silence in the funeral home grows too heavy, I think of him, of his cold smile, of his eyes that seem to see beyond this world. And I wonder if, somewhere, Logan is still listening to the dead, waiting for something only he can understand.